For most of us, boundaries didn't really come naturally. They came as a last resort. After we were drained, disrespected, or dismissed one too many times. We didn't draw a line because we felt peaceful. We drew the line because we were just done. And while that kind of boundary might stop the bleeding, it rarely heals the wound. Because anger might build a wall, but I think self-respect is what really builds that good foundation. At Bintegers, we believe that boundaries are born from worth and not from war. And integrity teaches us where we end and others begin. While intimacy reminds us that protecting our peace is not selfish, it's a sacred thing. There's a difference between boundaries made from anger and boundaries made from awareness. Anger says, you crossed me, so I'm shutting you out. Whereas awareness says, I love myself too much to keep letting this happen. The one is made in defense, whereas the other one it comes from our sense of dignity. And the truth is, most of us were never really taught healthy boundaries. We were taught compliance that was disguised more as kindness. And we learned that being good meant being agreeable. That saying yes was love, and that saying no was like rejection. And so we finally start setting boundaries. And when we do it, it can feel a lot like betrayal, because especially for those parts of us that learned to survive through people pleasing, in essence. But here's the thing though, boundaries are not barriers. Boundaries are blueprints. They don't block connection, they build it. Because honest connection can't really exist without clarity. So if someone can only stay in the relationship with you when you abandon yourself, see, that's not connection, that's control. So let's maybe get something straight here. You don't set boundaries to change people. You set boundaries to change the patterns of behavior. Boundaries are not about punishment as much as they are about protection. Not protection from others, but protection of your own alignment, right? And so when integrity leads in this process, your boundaries stop being reactive. They now become responsive. Anger might be the spark, but it's not the architect of it. Anger helps you notice maybe when something's off, but it's self-respect that helps you decide what you're going to do next. And that's the gift of this shift. You move from lashing out to leading yourself. You don't need to wait until you're furious to start protecting your peace. In fact, the earlier you begin honoring your discomfort, the less explosive that your reactions become later on. So boundaries built from early awareness, they whisper instead of scream out, right? They don't have to be dramatic, they just have to be clear. So think of boundaries as sort of like energetic agreements that you're making. They're not really about control, they're far more about clarity. You're not telling people how to act, you're just showing them how you'll respond if they don't, for example. So it's not about changing them, it's about choosing you. See, I think for so long we associated boundaries with rejection, right? We, like the thing is though, like boundaries are actually invitations to relate honestly. They say, here's what's going to help me stay connected to you without losing myself. And that's intimacy. That's integrity. That's adulthood. So if you're used to overgiving, your first boundaries will definitely feel mean, like you're being cruel, but that's normal. See, you're recalibrating what safety feels like. Because for most of your life, safe meant being liked. But now safe means authentic. Safe means you're in alignment. Safe means I can breathe. So you'll know a boundary is rooted in your worth when it doesn't really need an explanation, when you no longer feel the need to convince someone that your no is reasonable. Because people who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always find them unreasonable. And that's not your problem to solve. Self-respect says, I don't owe you my depletion to prove my devotion. It says, I can love you and still choose me as well. It says, I'm not available for relationships that are going to cost me my peace. And that kind of clarity does not create any distance. It just creates a direction. Boundaries are less about distance and much more about definition, if you will. They define how love can stay sustainable. They define how honesty can stay safe. And they define how peace can stay protected. So when you set a boundary from anger, you're still reacting to their power. But when you set it from self-respect, you're reclaiming your own power back. Let's talk about guilt for a second here, because I think it always shows up at this point too. The first time you start saying no, your nervous system might want to panic. It'll mistake peace for punishment. And you'll think, did I maybe overreact? Am I being cold in this scenario? And no, that's just the sound of your nervous system detoxing from the overexposure, if you will. You were conditioned to believe that harmony meant self-abandonment. And so when you finally choose alignment, it will feel wrong. Not because it is, but because it's new. See, every boundary is like a love letter to your future peace. And integrity helps you recognize that boundaries are not acts of rebellion. They're really acts of reverence. They're how we honor the life that we've worked so hard to heal. They're how we show gratitude for the growth that we fought for. See, you can't heal and still keep participating in what's actively breaking you down. Boundaries are this bridge, if you will, between awareness and embodiment. And sometimes the hardest boundaries that you may have to set aren't with other people as they are with yourself. See, the boundary that says, I will not talk to myself like that anymore, or I will not choose to chase closure from people who keep showing me that they're unavailable, or I will not confuse guilt with guidance, for example. I mean, that's kind of tough to say, right? But that's where worth gets real. When you start living like you actually believe it. Now, people might call you distant once maybe you start setting boundaries. But what they're really saying, though, is you've stopped giving me access, unearned access especially. And that's okay. You're not cold. You're just being clear. And clarity feels like distance to people who only knew you through your compliance. So boundaries don't make you hard. They make you honest. They're not about closing off. They're more about creating room for what's really real. So when you stop trying to please everyone around you, you're in essence creating space for authentic connection. Tomorrow in our episode, we're going to begin the final stretch of remembering the value that we may have forgotten, starting with how we're worthy even when we're in the midst of our healing. And in that episode, we're going to explore how to hold on to worth in the middle of your messiness, when everything feels unfinished, but you're still showing up with integrity and intimacy intact. But for now, let's maybe recap today's episode. Now, remember, anger reacts, but self-respect responds. Integrity will anchor you, and intimacy will refine you. And this is, I think, what the anatomy of peace could look like. You'll know you're in the maturing process when you stop setting boundaries to prove a point, and instead start setting them because you want to preserve your peace. There's no performance, there's no panic, there's no explanations necessary. There's just your desire to experience peace. Because peace does not need permission. Peace just needs your protection. And you're not hard to love because you have boundaries. You're just more difficult to manipulate because you now have self-respect. You're not cold. You're not inconsistent. You are more so consistent now. You're not being selfish. You're just being sovereign. And that's what healing does. It replaces the guilt with groundedness. Boundaries are not the end of connection. They're actually the beginning of what trust looks like. Because when people know where you stand, they can finally actually trust where to meet you in that engagement. And when you know where your peace begins, you can finally stop chasing where it ended. I hope this has served you well. I will see you in tomorrow's episode. Drop me a comment down below and let me know how this resonated with you. See you soon.